On the bottom of Daf Chaf Aleph Amid Aleph, about to turn to Chaf Aleph Amid Beis, the Gemara says the following: The Omar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish told us the following: My Dichsiv, what do we understand from a pasuk in Perek Chaf Daled of Sefer Vayikra, which we read just yesterday? It says, Al Hashulchan HaTahar, that the Lechem HaPodim have to be placed on a pure table that should not have been Mekabel Tumah, never contracted Tumah. So the Gemara says, Tar Mechlal Shu Tameh. This means that the wooden Shulchan would be able to be Mekabel Tumah. Therefore, the Torah is admonishing us to guarantee that the Shulchan is Tar. And now we turn to Daf Chaf Aleph on base. Is it really so that the Shulchan is susceptible to Kabbalah's Tumah? We have a principle in Kli Eitz. The Torah tells us in Vayikra Yud Aleph that amongst the Kalim that are Makabel Tumah, one is a wooden utensil and the other is a sock. And the Gemara derives the conclusion from this Hekesh that a wooden utensil that's susceptible to Tumah has to be Dumya de sock. And sock is something that could be carried mole, whether it's full, or rekon, whether it's empty, which means that it's got to be something movable. It's not permanently affixed in a stationary way. So the Gemara asks, Kli Eitz ha'osu l'nachasu, if you had to classify the shulchan, you would certainly classify it as a perfectly stationary, or as the Gemara calls it, nachas. Nachas means it's always in that place. We're not allowed to take the shulchan out of the heichal. It's always there, b'mokom kavua. And kol kli eitz ha'osu l'nachas eno mekabel tumah. It's not dumya the sack. Dumya the sack means it has to be like a sack which you carry, whether it's full, whether it's empty. This, by the way, excludes a very, very heavy wooden kli that cannot be moved because of its heaviness. Here it can't be moved because it has to be stationed in the heichal. And there's another rule here that anything that's not makabel tumah is chotesh b'fnei tumah. Notice if you have tumah in one place and you have a kli eitz that's kavua b'mkomo, that's nach, and on the other side of the kli eitz you have other people, the tumah will be retained. And the kli that's not makabel tumah is also a chotzetz. It also serves as a barrier preventing the spread of tumah. So therefore, Reish Lakish is now forced to reinterpret the shulchan. It must be that on some occasion they must have carried the shulchan out. Otherwise, it wouldn't be makabel tumah, and the Torah didn't have to tell us that it's got to be a shulchan atar. That when the Ole Regolim came to the Beis Hamikdash and they filled the Azara, this was a wonderful occasion to show them the great miracle that transpired in the Lechem HaPodim. And they would take the shulchan out. And this was, let's say, on a weekday. If Yom Tov fell on a weekday, they were able to take it out. And give me a second here. They carried it out. Oh, there's a whole discussion here about the fact that the shulchan was mitzupeh zav, but yet the main body of the shulchan was made of wood, and therefore it comes under this halacha of kli eitz. And if it's a wooden utensil that's designated to remain stationary in its place, it's not susceptible to tumah. Now, when Yom Tov falls out on a weekday, So the lechem aponim had to be on the shulchan. So they couldn't remove the lechem aponim from the shulchan and show it to the Jews. You follow? Why is it that Reish Lakish says that they took the shulchan out to show them the lechem aponim, the great miracle, the lechem aponim? Why didn't they just take the lechem out? The answer is during the week, you're not allowed to take the lechem out. The only day that you're allowed to take the lechem out is on Shabbos in order to replace it with the new lechem. So the shulchan would never be empty. The shulchan had to always have lechem on it. So that in order to show them the lechem during the week, they couldn't just take the lechem out because then the shulchan would be empty. They had to carry out the entire shulchan. That they would have to lift up the table to show it to the Ole Regel in order to demonstrate the love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the people of Israel. The Omer Lahem, they say, Re'u chibaschem lifnei hamakom. Look how beloved and cherished you are in front of the Almighty, that God brought about this great miracle, Shasiluko kisiduro, that when we're going to remove the lechem and replace it with the new lechem, it's the old lechem is still fresh and hot. And this was a great miracle that was meant to demonstrate chibasan shel makom shenemar. And how do we know that this actually took place? That during the regolim, they lifted up the shulchan and took it out of the heichal to show the people, shenemar losum lechem chom biyom hi lokchem, in order to show them the lechem that it was hot and fresh on the day that they took it out, as it was when they put it in, and they put it on the shulchan days before and even a week before. So the Gemara asks, V'su leka, there are no other miracles? Ve'ah omar of Oshia, b'shoshe bana shlomo beis hamikdash, nata bo kol mini megadim shel zav. This is an amazing miracle in which Shlomo HaMelech planted trees that gave fruits that were gold, and the Kohanim would pluck those fruits and sell them on the market. That's how they got a parnasa, because they weren't working, they weren't getting any wages. This was an amazing miracle in the Beis Hamikdash. There's a whole discussion here about how the Kohanim could use the gold fruit for their own purposes, and there would be an Isur Me'ilah. But in any event, there were certain specific times when they would take those fruits that grew on the tree, and the wind would blow the fruit off the tree. Shenemar, and this is based on the pasuk in Tehillim, Yirash Halvanon Piryo. The fruit rustled like that of the Lebanon. The Lebanon here is an allusion to the Beis Hamikdash, and David HaMelech is saying that the fruit of Israel should grow in abundance and rustle when the wind blows on it, like the fruit of the Beis Hamikdash. So we see that there was fruit that grew in the Beis Hamikdash, and this was not ordinary fruit. This was miraculous fruit. And the tree itself didn't have halachim and eitz, because you're not allowed to plant an eitz in the Azara. And this was a great miracle that took place in Shlomo HaMelech's Migdash. However, ultimately these trees dried up, and when the Goyim came in to destroy the Migdash, the trees dried up. Shenemar, and here the Gemara quotes a pasuk in Nachum. It says, "Uperach Levanon umlal." The flower of the Lebanon is devastated. But But at the end of time, with the Migdash Shlishi, we'll get back this miraculous gold tree. Shenemar Paroch Tifrach V'Sagel. This is probably Yeshaya Novi. Af Gilas V'Ranein Kvod Alavon Lo. It will blossom abundantly and will rejoice, even with the joyousness and the glad song. The glory of Lebanon has been given to her. So again, the miracle occurred at the time of Shlomo Melech's Migdash, and it's not necessary to count and the miracles and limit that count to those that took place in both the Bayis Rishon and the Bayis Sheni. And for example, the Gemara had mentioned earlier the miracle of the Aron, that only took place in Bayis Rishon, or the Kruvim, that took place only in Bayis Rishon. So this list of miracles in the Mishnah and Avos that we're dealing with refers to miracles that took place exclusively in Bayis Rishon. And the Gemara says, Nisi de Kvi lo kachashiv. The list in the Mishnah only includes those miracles that took place regularly, but from time to time. They were permanently fixed miracles in the Mikdash. Those are not even counted. So, for example, the fact that this eitz that was producing golden trees, that great miracle is not listed in the Mishnah because it's kvi, it's fixed. Hashados lahachi Aaron ukruvim nami. Now we can answer the question we asked earlier. Why isn't the miracle of the fact that the Aaron and the Kruvim did not take up any space listed in the Mishnah? Nisi the kvi ninu, because these were permanently fixed in the Mikdash. Omar Mar, we learned in the Bryce, Ashan Hamaroch, that there was a great miracle with regard to the pillar of smoke that came out of the Haktorah on the Marocha on top of the Mizbeach. Frekti Gemara, mihavi Ashan b'Marocha. Was there at all smoke that came out of the fire in the Mikdash on the Mizbeach? Asani, we learned in the Bryce Chamisha Dvarim Nemer b'H Shel Marocha. 5 descriptions of the fire on the Mizbeach. Revuta Kari. It had the appearance that it was crouched like a lion. Ubara Kecham. It was clear as the sun. The Yeshba Mamish. But we'll come back to Yeshba Mamish in a minute. Bocheles Lachin Kiavation. It would consume not only things that were dry, but even that which was moist. And finally, V'enamala Osham. And it did not produce a pillar of smoke. Now, what does it mean, V'yesh ba mamish? He says here that V'yesh ba mamish means the flame itself had substance. So I'm not sure if I can understand that miracle. Normally, you could put your finger through a fire. I mean, it doesn't really have any substance to it. To davar shein bo mamish, as the Gemara says in Bava Kama. But apparently, in the case of the Eish in the Mizbeach, it was a davar sheish bo mamish. But in any event, it says Eina Mala Osha. There was no pillar of smoke. So how can you tell me that there was a pillar of smoke, just that there was no wind that could actually dissolve that pillar? There was never a pillar of smoke to begin with. The Gemara answers, Kikam Rinon Bidehejot. In other words, there were 2 fires on the Mizbeach. There was one fire that's called the Hejot fire. Sanya, it says in a Brayso in Asnu, Bnei Aaron HaKohen Eish Ala Mizbeach. Afal Pishe Eish Yoredis Min HaShamayim Mitzvah Lahavi Min HaHejot. That there were 2 fires on the Mizbeach. One fire came down from Shamayim, and the other came from the Hejot. An ordinary person would light a fire. And the reason for that is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, don't rely on the miracle of the Eish coming down from Shamayim. we want you to have an ordinary material, natural fire that would produce a pillar of smoke. With regard to the fire that descended miraculously from heaven, it did not produce smoke. But the fire that came from a hedgehog, we were enjoying to burn, that had smoke to it. Revutza ka'ari, the fire had a shape like a crouched lion. Vasanya, Omrav Chaninos Gan Kohanim, Aniri Sio Rutza Kelev. It was crouched like a dog. Lokash, Kan B'Migdash Richon, Kan B'Migdash Sheni. During the time of the first Migdash, which was greater in its miracles, it was crouched like a lion. But in Migdash Sheni, which is described by Rav Chanidas Gan Kohanim, there the fire took on the shape of a crouched dog. Okay, there's a long marsha here to explain the difference between Migdash Rich and Migdash Sheni. Gemara asks, Migdash Sheni mi havoi? Was there in fact a fire that came down from Shemayim? There were many things that were missing in Bayis Sheni from that we had in Bayis Rishon, and amongst them was Eish Yoredis Min HaShamayim. Omar Shmuel Bar Inya, my Diksiv. How do we interpret the pasuk in Chagai Novi? Vertsebo va'ichavda, and there's a hey missing at the end of the word va'ichavda. Now, this pasuk of Chagai is a prophecy foretelling the second Beis Hamikdash, and Hashem declares, "Va'erta bo, I'll be pleased with it, and I will be honored by the second Beis Hamikdash." V'karina v'ichavda, we read it as if there was a hey at the end, but ma'ishna de mechusar hey. So why is it written in a way that the hey is left out? And the answer is the hey represents 5 miracles that were absent in Migdash Sheni, and therefore the hey is removed to indicate the missing 5 miracles. Bain Migdash Rishon Migdash Sheni, that differentiate the first Migdash from the second Eluhe. What was unique to the first Migdash? Number 1, Aron v'Kapores ukruvim. All this was put into Geniza, and already Shlomo HaMelech knew, and he built below the Migdash a digging for the purpose of hiding the Aron. Aish, the Aish that came down from Shemayim, was missing in the second Migdash. Ushchina, the divine presence. The Ruach HaKodesh, the Urim v'Tumim. And the Mepharshim point out that there was a Choshen, because that's one of the clay Big Day Kohen, so he couldn't do the Avodah without the Choshen, but the Urim v'Tumim, which was written on a parchment and placed into the Choshen, that was actually missing, which means that the great miracle, the Urim v'Tumim, where the Kohen Gadol, if he concentrated on the name of Hashem, and the Urim v'Tumim, certain letters would light up in the Choshen, and the Choshen had, of course, the 12 stones, and then he was able to read messages through the Urim v'Tumim. It was really an intense kind of Ruach HaKodesh. And unfortunately, all this was missing in Bayis Sheni, including the age that came down from Shemayim. Omri, the Gemara answers, Ein mihava hava, siyua lo Messiah. The Brisa here doesn't mean to say, I should say the statement of Rav Shmuel, that there was no Eish min Shemayim during Bayis Sheni. There was an Eish, but Siyua lo Messiah, it didn't help anything. It came down from Shemayim, but it didn't burn anything that was on the Mizbeach. And offhand, that's very strange that a fire came down from heaven during the Beis Hamikdash Rishon and consumed all the karbanos. And they only took an extra fire because the Torah commanded them to do so. But in the case of Bayis Sheni, the fire came down, but it didn't burn the karbanos. So they had to bring an ordinary fire min hahejot in order to burn the kodshim. So I guess the fire min hashamayim was just a message that the Shekhinah is somewhere there, not exactly in the Mikdash. Tanur Rabbanu learned to the Brisa, Sheish Ishos Haim. There are 6 categories of age. Yesh Ocheles Ve'en Shosa, Yesh Shosa Ve'en Ocheles, Yesh Ocheles V'Shosa, Yesh Ocheles Lachin Kiyaveshim, V'yesh Eish Docha Eish, V'yesh Eish Ocheles Eish. So the Gemara is going to now go through these 6 categories of Eish one by one. Number 1, Yesh Eish Ocheles V'ena Shosa. Adidan, this is the Eish of Hedjot, and the Eish of Hedjot that we brought on the Mizbeach was capable of consuming solids. That's called Ocheles, but not liquids. Now we get to the second category, Shosa V'ena Ocheles. There's a fire that drinks, but does not eat, Dechulin. This is a reference to temperature. When a person has temperature, we consider the fever as if it was a fire. And as a result of that fire, he had to drink. He was dehydrated, but he had no appetite. Ocheles V'Shosa, there's a fire that has both eating and drinking. And that's the Eliyahu. There was a great miracle on Har Carmel at the time of the Baal, and that was the miracle that was brought about by Eliyahu Hanavi when he challenged the Nevi'ah Baal to demonstrate their deity. And it says, V'samayim asher betala lechacha, lechecha. And it licked up the water in the trench. So what happened was that he called upon, one second, what is this Eish? This is, the Ocheles V'Shos is Eliyahu's Eish. Because he asked the Nevi'ah Baal to offer on the Mizbeach and ask their God to send a fire which would consume their karbanos. And what Eliyahu did was he poured water on the karbanos and also on his carbon. And yet a fire of Hashem descended and consumed the carbon of Eliyahu, and it also licked up the water. So that was called the Eish El Eliyahu Mayim and Ocheles V'Shosa. Now we have Ocheles Lachim Uyeveshim D'Marocha, the fire that came down over the Mizbeach would be able, as we saw earlier, to consume both moist and dry. Yesh Eish Docha Eish. What's a fire that repels a fire? That's the Gavriel. And now we're talking about the incident of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, when Nebuchadnezzar, as the Gemara says, the Psachim threw them into a fiery furnace. And Hashem sent Gabriel to challenge the fire in that furnace and save Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and cool off the furnace. Yesh, Eish, Ocheles, and what's Eish? That's Eish Doches. And what's Eish, Ocheles, Eish? The Shechina, the Yoma Mar, Hoshit et bo beineim usrafan, which literally translates, he extended his fingers amongst them and consumed them. And this is based on a Gemara in Sanhedrin Chaf Ches, that during the Yemei HaMasa, when God was creating the world, the Malachim tried to interfere. They didn't want to allow Chas v'shalom the Almighty to create man. They had it in against man, the angels. And God had to extend his finger and consume them. So the fire of the divine Shekhinah consumes the fiery angels, and that's called Eish Ocheles Eish. Now the Gemara goes back to the discussion about the pillar of smoke that came from the Maracha on the Mizbeach. The Ashen, Vashana Maracha, Afilu Kol Aruchos Sheba Olam, Ein Mezizin Oso Mimkoma. Right? We said in the Mishnah that the winds could not move the smoke. V'amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, we're going to prove now in contradiction that the winds would actually blow the pillar of smoke. And this has to do with the end of Shmini Atzeres. On Shmini Atzeres, the Mishnah tells us in Tainus that there was a din on rain for the entire year, how much rain we would have. And if there was an abundance of rain, that would allow the produce to grow, and that was good for the aniyim, because since it was a serious volume of fruits and grains available in the market, that would bring down the price, so even the poorer members of society could afford food. And on Motzei Shmini Atzeres, the people wanted to see what was the judgment that took place on Shmini Atzeres. And they were able to determine the judgment by the way that the wind started blowing. Not the direction that the wind blew, but the direction from which the wind blew, the source of the wind. So this is Motzei Shmini Atzeres. Hakol Tzofim, everyone is looking Lashana Marocha to see the smoke of the pyre as it rose from the Mizbeach. And in which direction is it shifting? And for the very fact that the winds are blowing the Maracha, the Ashan on the Maracha in one direction or another, we see that the winds could budge the Ashan. Note klapei tzafon. So if the drifting was towards the north, it means that the source of that wind was a southerly wind. Is aniyim smechim ubalabatim atzevim. Why? Mipnei shegishmei shana merubim, which is good for the aniyim, because if there's plenty of this year's rains, because the southern wind would bring rain, and yet Eroseim markivim. So there was produce in the silos that would rot because the southern wind brings rain in abundance. However, that increases the humidity. The increased humidity accelerates the deterioration process of the crop that is stored in the silos. So what would happen is that the sellers would have to drop their prices because they desperately needed to sell greater amounts of the stored food quickly before it would deteriorate. So this was all great for the aniyim. Nota klape darom, but if the winds came from the north, and therefore was nota klape the south, aniyim atzevim. This is a great disappointment to the aniyim. Bali batim smechim, what should we call them? The sellers, the merchants, they would be very happy. Why? Because what happens is that when there's a wind from the north, then it is what we call infrequent rains, and it's enough rain to sustain the crop in the fields, but it's dry climate relatively, and that would allow the produce in the storehouses to remain fresh for a long time and not deteriorate. So the merchants now would have a massive amount of produce to sell in the marketplace. And they wouldn't sell it until the market price rose. They were in the driver's seat now. So that would ensure a greater profit for themselves, but that was a difficulty for the Aniyim. They should gishmei shana mu'atim, the northern wind has a limited amount of rain, but since it's not moist, but rather dry, therefore the produce would keep well in the storehouses. Not the klape mizrach. Now we're talking about winds that come from the west, which are stable. They bring just enough rain to ensure an abundant crop. It would not cause the deterioration of food in the silos that was stored. And this is good for everybody. Hakol smeichim. In other words, the prices were a fair price. Okay, we're trying to make a siyum on the first parak of Yoma. Klape Marov. If, on the other hand, the wind came from the east, Hakol Atsevim, everybody was distressed. Why? Because the winds from the east are extremely hot and dry, and therefore there are conditions of drought. That's going to lead to a shortage of produce, inflated prices, and no one's going to benefit from that. So the Gemara asks again the stira, and the answer is the azil v'asi b'dikli v'ibdure lo avi mivdar, that the winds would cause a swaying back and forth of the ashan, of the smoke, like palm trees that sway from one side to the other, but it would never be dispersed. Omar Mar, we learned klapi mizrach hakol tzmeichim, klapi mayrav hakol atzevim uramini, mizrachis li olam yotha. Here it says that the east wind foretells good, and we said before that, on the contrary, that the winds from the east are extremely hot and dry. And then it says here in this brisa that Maravis Liolam Kasha, the winds from the west are difficult. Ruach Tzfonis Yafal Echitim B'Shashe Viu Shlish, so that the winds from the north are good for wheat once they have already reached a third of their maturity. Kasha L'Zeisim B'Zman Shem Chodim, but they're not good for the olive trees when they are blossoming. Ruach Drom is Kasha L'Chitim B'Shashe Viu Shlish. The winds from the south are bad for wheat that has grown a third. V'Yafal L'Zeisim B'Zman Shem Chodim, when they are blossoming. And now we have a memory device. Omer Rabbi Yosef became a Marzutra. Simonech, if you want to remember it, a mnemonic device, is Shulchan B'Tzafon U'Menorah B'Daram. In the Azara, or rather I should say more precisely, in the Heichal, the Mizbeach, the Shulchan was in the north and the menorah was in the Daram, in the south. Hai Marbadideh, v'Hai Marbadideh. So the Shulchan cultivates its own, the menorah cultivates its own. The Shulchan, which held the lechem aponim that was made of wheat, the menorah burned of olive oil. So the Shulchan in the north reminds us that northerly winds are good for wheat. The menorah in the south reminds us that southerly winds are good for olives. But in any event, the Brisa says that the exact opposite is true of the east and west winds. How do we reconcile that? Lo kasha halon v'halahu. It depends on where you're located on the face of the earth. Are you in Bavel or in Eretz Yisrael? Both teachings are correct. And if we assume that a westerly wind is a good sign foretelling abundance of rain, and the easterly wind foretells dry weather, it depends where you are geographically located on the face of the earth. That brisa that considers the easterly winds good, that's in Bavel. Bavel is a country where the soil is naturally moist, and large quantities of rain can be detrimental. The teaching that considers these winds bad refers to the land of Israel, which requires much, much more rainfall because of its hilly terrain that does not retain water well. Hadron, Alecha, Eric, Shivas Yomim, and tomorrow Mitzvah Hashem will begin Daf Chaf Beis, the second perek of Masechet Yoma, the perek that deals with the paisos and the various avodos on a daily basis in the Beis Hamikdash. Thanks. Wishing you a great day.